Welcome everyone to the Augmented Society Network. My name is Zoe Camper. The ASN is a Royal Society of the Arts and Manufacture thematic network. We explore, collaborate and reflect on the future of human interaction with technology and its impact on society. You can check out our work on the augmentedsociety.org website and see some of our output. There's audio, podcasts and words. Today's session is session 2 of our Back to School series, looking at the impact of the pandemic on lifelong learning. In previous sessions earlier in the year, we identified 3 key areas for action. Those are education, value and resourcing. We will be producing 3 white papers in 2021 in partnership with the Royal Society of Arts. This session is about collaborating and exploring education and learning in order for us to create meaningful thought leadership in the global education landscape. Collaborators, and we are looking for collaboration here because we are crowdsourcing the white paper, will be fully credited and included as part of the publication process. So this is a really exciting opportunity for you to have your views aired and published. This session is being recorded and will be published as part of the Augmented Society Network's website at augmentedsociety.org. Jonathan Tavs, co-founder of the ASN, will be taking us into the topic today. So welcome, Jonathan, and over to you.
Thanks, Zoe. Always great to see everybody from multiple nations, backgrounds joining us, as it is the Augmented Society Network. We are all about the betterment of the future of society and utilizing all the tools that are available to us. And with this, we are entering part 2 of our education sessions. And it really could seem like we're trying to boil the ocean, and we absolutely could get held up in the minutia. We know that there is a lot of variance based on, it could be based on where you are in one city, that there's going to be differences. And we had a very productive first session, which if you were not able to join us for that, you can always go to augmentedsociety.org. And again, the audio is there. It's also on YouTube. From that, we were able to start diving into what are the things that need to happen. If we look at the pandemic, not as just a blip in our history, but as an opportunity to truly move forward with a fresh start. There are many things in society that were broken that the pandemic has shown a very bright light on. And so as opposed to trying to do incremental change, we're looking at this as an opportunity to put out some thought leadership, thought guidance. If we could start all over again, knowing what we know, where did we go wrong and what can we do better? And so I want to set the framework of how we think in those terms. Another piece that came out from the last session was we went through all these pieces, and there were specificities based on the age of students, a lot of reference to kids, children, versus teachers versus whatever. And in the last 5 minutes, I think Bob and Amy brought up about, well, what really are we talking about here? Is it K through 12? Is it K through 16? And we decided that really, let's look at this as a societal education piece so that it is a lifelong learning. And what are the core pieces that we can espouse, that we can really dive deeper into to help others as they get into the minutia of possibly filling those needs. So as we're thinking about this, yes, certainly the elements of traditional education that we've all grown up with are a part of this, but what could we learn from it? So we will be looking for people to carry the torch on deeper discovery, whether it's writing 2 or 4 pages just to get the ball rolling in terms of looking deeper. So with that being said, there were some really key pieces that came about. Go through, anybody can read these, but I'll go through what really resonated to me, with me from that first conversation. It is about content, but it's also about context. And we know that culturally, there's a lot of difference, right? So we sort of have to do our thinking in terms of a big ball of what are some very general guidelines that can be followed. And a lot of, then it comes down to what are those pieces? So if it is the 4Cs, we are deficient in a lot of ways in thinking creatively or critically or collaborating with others. You know, how can we utilize education for the betterment of that? And communication obviously would be the fourth C. Another one is the social benefit of education, the joining together. We look at the ASN sessions as a form of us developing educationally and learning together. And I can't say enough how much I love this exercise, just because even if it was the matter of the social aspect, it's tremendous. Another piece that we were talking about is the reevaluation of what needs to be measured. If we were talking about humans are going to be overtaken by computers, if we're only learning what we could otherwise do by asking Siri or Google or whatever on a computer, where are we lapsing? And we know that technology, everything is changing at such an astronomical pace. What can we do to be more agile? Because we're going to have to, another piece that was brought up in the last session, people have to go through retraining anyway. You know, they might learn a certain industry and then who knows, that industry can be gone. And so how do we relearn? So that's another thing. And then another key factor is, how do we assess benchmarks? How do we recognize whether we're evolving, growing, what have you? Because it's too much attention has been put on passing. There hasn't been an opportunity to enable learners to fail and learn from failure. So those to me resonated very strongly. We have this list that we can go through and maybe spend the beginning of the session really trying to narrow down. The goal from this hour is to have a very strong sense of where do we go from here. So part of that, we believe, is to come up with, let's say, 5 to 8 core components that feed into the bigger whole. Again, will all be evolving as we work through this. We'll be looking for people to raise their hand to take that on, each one of those, and it really could be 2 to 4 pages of just diving deeper. Then we can share that with the group of all those who want to participate. I'll stop right there in terms of session to get into the mechanicals. If you are interested in carrying this forward through to completion of the white paper, please be sure to email Zoe or myself. I don't want to talk much anymore. I want to help facilitate the conversation amongst the tremendous amount of talent that we have amongst all of you. And again, thank you for joining us. Let's start this exercise. If we were to narrow down to 5, what would those 5 elements be for future of successful education?
I've been drilled on the 4 C's to death. And I love them in part, but I kind of think we need to reimagine them in a way. And, you know, I proposed a couple of new ones. I think culture is something that we keep coming back to over and over again, because if you don't account for culture, end of story, learning can't take place. It's going to be a force of will oftentimes. And I think the world is becoming more diverse and more multicultural. And I don't just mean that in terms of nation states and languages. I also mean that in terms of trying to include into society different people whose minds maybe think differently, are neurodiverse, and have been excluded previously, but are now expected to be included. So culture to me is huge, because if you don't include it, anything going forward is destined, I think, to fail. And I also think the idea of curiosity, I see that as that's really what's driven innovation for a very long time. Yeah, necessity, yeah, innovation, but really it's just people tinkering around with stuff because they're curious as hell. And now if everything's at your fingertips for Google, curiosity requires sustained attention. It requires that failure that we were talking about. And it really is a driver, I think, of motivation.
So that to me is part of the structure. It's the themes of what we all need sitting on top of the structure, because we've talked about previously that what we would see as terrible is that everybody thinks that online learning is the way forward. and we have spoken about whole world learning. So where it's good to be present, and what those things might be that you do for that would certainly be culture and curiosity. Those would fall into that. What it's possible to do remotely and contemplatively alone. I've been talking to other people who haven't been able to make it today, who said that their children have thrived without distraction. But I've equally spoken to people who have said that their children are looking more inward and more at self than other. I do believe more so than any time that we are creating too much other in the world, too much they. So I wonder if there's that element, or is it important that we need to think about that now, that what we're offering, what we're trying to describe is whole world, so that's clear.
I like that. There are some people, Carlos and In Thinking Leader 3, whom I don't know your human name, both have put in development as a human being and citizen, the social benefits, the social emotional learning, environment where there can be exploration, trial and error.
I just want to add regarding the academic basics. I still think that these basics are very important. I'm seeing more and more often these basics, often young kids or teenagers are lacking of. And without having certain basics, it's very difficult then to get into project-based learning or all this new kind of setups at high school, at colleges. And I think this is something where, for example, the virtual learning can help out a lot, because you can individualize it, and kids which have more issue with something can work harder on it and do not prevent others to move or accelerate, which are driving with online learning. So I still think that academic basics should be a very important topic in the whole thinking about education for the future, because Google alone is easy to look up facts, but to connect facts, you need certain basics.
Could you outline what you consider to be the basics? Because I wonder if we all perhaps consider them differently.
Well, this is now probably we could discuss all week, but I think language is important, like be it English or your mother tongue, because if you are bad in your mother tongue, and I have seen that often with immigrants, if they are lacking of their mother tongue, they are usually not learning a second language, a third or a fourth one. Then math is always needed, and I think history or social science, as it is called, I think their education, the whole curriculum is quite clear, might be a core. I'm here not that experienced to say exactly to define what is the absolute core. But
so in my UK experience as a teacher, the basics are outlined in a matrix, which are then woven into the themes and the delivery of each subject. And those are things like a comprehension, an ability to describe. Is that what other people are considering as well in terms of just basic sort of human functionality?
I think it's interesting when we look at the 4 C's, or we look at that, that it comes down from the district and says that we're now going to do the 4 C's, or comes from this, the state government. And then all of a sudden everyone says, okay, well then we don't have to do the thing that we were doing before. And then all of a sudden we have these kids who are being asked to communicate, but then have not been taught the skills on how to communicate in written form or in verbal form. And that goes back to those basics. You can't go to the 4 C's if we don't have that foundation laid out first. It's the context. If we want, the precocious kids have really amazing ideas and love to hear themselves talk, but then do they really know where that came from? I mean, if they just pulled it out of Wikipedia, that's a lucky strike as opposed to something that is profound. So I agree that the academic basics are needed in order for that discussion to be worthwhile, because they're just going to want to talk. The digital literacy is going to be one of those academic basics.
Breslin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, sorry, it's Tony Breslin. I don't know what's happened to my first name there. I think one of the traps we must not fall into, and that's why I'm really heartened by the discussion, is we mustn't fall into that trap that because we believe passionately in all the progressive and creative stuff, that we somehow allow ourselves to be seen as not caring about whether we call them the basics or not. But that kind of thing where in a sense the traditionalists own all the stuff that some people like to call the basics or real education or whatever, and we own all the fluffy stuff. And that actually it's not a matter of doing attainment or inclusion. It's not a matter of doing basics or much more than basics. It's about finding a way in which we do those together and bring them together. And I just think often we get into these kind of false binaries, and you know, it seems to me that literacy, oracy, numeracy, digital literacies are incredibly vital, but actually we have to do those in ways that are creative and innovative and recognise diversity and all the rest of it. Just a couple of things I've got down. I've given a very quick scan, and I wasn't at the earlier session, but it strikes me three things that I think we need to keep in mind. The obvious one is that young kids going into reception or you know, first class now, whatever you call it, wherever you're from, when they leave school or when they leave education, which will probably be a bit later, you know, most of them are going to work in industries that don't yet exist, producing things that haven't yet been thought of, serving needs that we don't at the moment know we have. And I think sort of just doing some real thinking about what does that mean for educators. I think for me, there's a massive thing around attachment and trauma-aware stuff. And I think that unless you do attachment and trauma-aware stuff, you just give mouth service to inclusion. And so I kind of think that there's something there. But the other thing is, I think we've got to kind of, if we're going to have life-wide learning, we've got to create learning that is fun. We've got to create an appetite for learning. We've got to bring the joy back into the room. And some of the testing regimes and all of that have just driven that too far from the door. Just
for my sake, just describe a little more about attachment trauma. It's not a term I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I'm UK based as well. I'm actually an adoptive parent. I'm a trustee at Adoption UK. So we do a lot of work around early childhood trauma, detachment, attachment, etc. But we don't own all the trauma. You know, lots of children pass through traumatic experiences. And in a sense, you could argue because our world today is both more creative and innovative, and, you know, because all our children will have multiple careers, not single ones, and all that kind of stuff. In a sense, the potential for trauma and detachment and so forth is much richer. And there's quite a significant emergence now, some colleagues will be aware of this, of kind of attachment-aware schooling. I mean, really good example. I've just finished work on a book called Lessons from Lockdown. But the whole thing of children having gone through this period, some of whom never much liked school, have absolutely thrived. Some, and you know, that's going to be an issue. How do we bring those kids back in? And these don't go down the simple binaries of rich or poor, but there are some correlations. And then what about those who've absolutely, as Zoe said, been traumatized by the isolation and so forth? You know, curriculum catch-up, piece of cake. Psychological, social, interactive catch-up, incredibly complex and difficult. You wouldn't think it was that way around from the media here anyway. But
I actually feel that they go hand in hand.
Of course they do.
Because, because you see it with, again, looking at the tools that we have now.
Yeah.
Where there is a teacher that usually the way that I've seen it with remote learning is that they're the center with a bunch of spokes in a wheel. Yeah. And no matter how good your technology is, you can't right now replicate the environment, the atmosphere of being in a space, holding that space to be able to guide and be a part of the group. And so it's, how are we going to do that? So to your point, so that there is a sense of success, a sense of belonging, a sense of attachment.
So what goes with that is that some children who are terrified by that space when they're in it actually prefer this level of distance.
Right.
So it's just, I think we've just got to point up the complexity at each level.
Right.
But certainly, and that's my whole point about rebalancing attainment and inclusion. I've always been massively for the standards agenda. I just think you actually raise standards and you raise all that performance stuff by building inclusion. You don't do it by saying, forget inclusion, we'll just do test scores. It seems to me that that's where attachment, I mean, that's why I feel from a progressive point of view, we mustn't get painted into that fluffy corner, because actually you only get the best out of all children if you do attachment awareness, if you do inclusion, if you support hyperdiversity, and so on. And those things are not the leftovers to be done after the basics.
Right.
They're the way of getting far more people to succeed in the basics and much more. Does that make sense? I mean, kind of.
Mhm.
Yeah. Just
Absolutely.
to ask again, is there any element of that which is about understanding and coping with less certainty? Are you alluding to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is that in the jargon, as we go into the kind of postmodern, as we go into multiple career lives, as we go into portfolio working, as we go into maybe much less employment or employment having a lesser role, go back 50 years, an awful lot of jobs were jobs for life, an awful lot more partnerships were partnerships for life. All the institutions of society, 25-year mortgages and all that stuff, were built on those kind of certainties. So, yeah, I guess what I'm saying, that how do we, in many ways a much more exciting world. You know, you're not going to spend 50 years down the pit or whatever it may be, but it's actually also much more complex. And I think we need our young people to be much more confident. I think we need to be much more confident ourselves, you know, and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I fell upon some of this trauma stuff partly through my work in the adoption community and some earlier stuff I'd done in inclusion. But I see a much wider application actually in some of the really innovative work with really marginalised groups. We might find some solutions. I mean, simple stats, the one I always give, but in the UK, adopted children are 20 times more likely to be permanently excluded. Mm-hmm. Now that dwarfs every other group. What's really phenomenal about that is most of those kids are situationally middle class, because the way the adoption system works is that essentially it won't let you adopt unless it defines you as middle class first. So what you've got is a phenomenal rate of exclusion amongst a cohort of middle class children. Complete sociological contradiction. Let's look at some of those contradictions. Anyway,
right. So Tony, I appreciate that. Being a father of an adopted child myself, I know that we can get into the minutia of that, but that idea of that there is exclusion as much as inclusion, and how do we bridge that gap? How do we make it so that it's all there? Any other thoughts?
Very interesting listening to what people have been saying. And I was wondering if some of the different strands that we're talking about here might come back to differentiation and the idea that we could improve inclusion and reduce anxiety and improve the education experience for students through improving differentiation through online platforms or online learning. In the classroom, I've been a teacher for the last 6 years. I at least manage my students very differently depending on what sort of social interaction style they like. Some students might want to have a little bit more of a chat when they come into the room. Some students might want to be left alone for a bit before they settle down. The style of work, the way that you help and support students, it's very much individually tailored. Through online learning, or at least my experience of it, is that that's been much harder to try and give personal interactions with students, because writing an email takes longer than maybe just having a chat with a student when they're there in the room. Obviously, you can't just look over their shoulder and see how they're doing. And in a live sort of broadcast session, you can't give each individual student time when you're all running things live. Otherwise, in a class of 30 students in an hour session, that's only 2 minutes per student. So maybe if there are ways of thinking about how we can improve the differentiation in the activities and the interactions we have with students, that might help to improve dialogue and inclusion.
Interestingly, Ben, what you said was very similar to what Tony was saying, where it is about discomfort of the students and the teachers, or the educators, let's call them, right? And not really feeling comfortable with how to approach this differentiation and how to, and Ben, I was really happy to hear you talk about your understanding of how individual students wanted to be addressed and being able to do that in a space where, yes, we might not be able to do that through digital only. And so it is, how do we create the tools to do that? But fear is a huge aspect of that.
Ashley.
Oh, yes, thanks very much. Yes, that's just very briefly on the basic skills. I think becoming a confident communicator, sound oral skills is so important. I'm lucky that my granddaughter goes to a primary school. The head was actually, his first career was as an actor. And those children, I've seen them, you know, in performance, that sort of thing. They're strikingly confident for their age. The other thing is about oracy and so forth, is that in the UK anyway, 50 years ago, you learned French from a textbook. You virtually didn't open your mouth, and you couldn't be understood when you went across the channel. The third thing is, I think in the UK, a lot of people would agree through the Department of Education gone pretty overboard on punctuation and that sort of thing. But I think we've lost the balance in that area. Say no more.
Thank you. All good stuff. And interestingly, we've lost punctuation, perhaps partially because of texting and technology.
Yes, could be.
Funny that you brought up that. There's a radio program called Away with Words, and I was able to have actually met him at a TED Talk, and the programmer was talking about how text speak and how language is so plastic and it's changing, and that what do we do? Do we let this happen, or do we fight the fight and say, no, we're not going to let this? And he says, no, it's always evolving. This is how we're going to be communicating. When I was at university, one of the joke majors you could have was communications, is that's what the athletes would do. It's changed, and it's 100% on its head, that now that's going to be the focus. And I think of looking at all of them, communications is going to be critically important, because that is the diversity issue. It has to do with how we can recognize the other, and how do we actually communicate with that other is going to be a really important factor as we move forward.
I agree totally with you, Timothy. I agree. That's going to be very important.
If I could take this moment to keep track of where we are, it seems like the 4 C's plus a C that Amy had talked about is a main one, and that would include that communication thing that we just talked about. The platform for, I'll call it the platform for agility, you know, to prepare learners for the future unknown so that they can adapt appropriately and not be afraid of what's to come. The accessibility, the inclusivity, but also the acknowledgement of difference or differentiation. And how do you create an environment in which people can utilize different tastes, tendencies, likes in order to learn what those basics are, whatever those basics are. And then I guess I would do a fourth one is an establishment of the basics. What is really necessary? So carrying on any, Amy, I thought yours was funny. Emojis are the way of the future.
True.
I think also, yeah, what we need to, what would be good here is to understand the international nature of this. I didn't really know what the 4 C's were until relatively recently, being a UK teacher.
Right. So it needs to be a universality.
Yeah, we need to consider as well in how we put all of this together.
John, you wanted to raise a point?
Hello, hi, I'm John Mee from Alive and Kicking Theatre Company in Leeds. The picture for me is around the model of teaching and learning I'm particularly interested in, the idea of setting a context and a purpose for the activity. And of course, that's, I suppose, in a sense, what Ashley was talking about a little bit earlier on when he was looking at his work in the grandchildren working in drama, which is the basis for my work as well, but not in terms of the performance he was describing, but in the terms of commissioning children to be able to address their learning with a purpose and in a context, whether that context is real in terms of, working towards advising, working towards designing for a particular community purpose, or whether it is an invented one. I'm doing one next week for National Poetry Day, which is around Frederick the Fisherman, that's me, being chased by the blue men of Bridlington, who will drag him down to the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the ocean unless you can do better poetry than they can. And of course, Frederick the Fisherman is crap at poetry, but fortunately, he's got a gang at Robin Hood Primary School who can be commissioned to write the poetry. And agreed, that is, if you like, there's a metaxis. It's being in the real world while they do it, but at the same time, we're in the invented world. I think the commission model for teaching is a very interesting one. So I'd like to add purpose and context.
Right, and it's so interesting that the Brits keep on bringing up the blue meanies. What's up with that? You guys were really offended by blue people at one point in history.
You know who they are. You may not know who they are, but they are indeed the blue men of the Minch, who are, the Minch is the passage about the Outer Hebrides, and it's when the fog comes down, and if you happen to be in a rowing boat, a hand will come over the side unless you can do better songs or better art or better thinking than they can. You're gone.
Well, I absolutely did not know that, John.
First time for everything.
Fabulous, yeah. I think something that we will need to consider, although it doesn't have to be a priority, is the aspect of trying to score or mark or prioritize people out of a system. We've talked before about schools being, selection factories for different organizations to take and pick and choose. Is that something that we want to consider? So you've got 5 GCSEs or 5 A-levels and you're in, 4 you're out. What of that element of marking, scoring, rationalizing do we want to include in this?
So Zoe, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I was just about to bring up a thought that I had based on the last call that we had, where it was brought up that just because you went to college doesn't mean you're going to get this great job. Like, certainly going to certain institutions, you'll have a bigger door to walk through. But some people haven't gone to university and have done quite well. And it runs the gamut, really. So we had talked also about more marketing or promotion of the fact that you can find your own path, that like no time before, you could find your own path. And so to that point of scoring, and now brought up in this conversation about self-confidence and belief in self, whether that's through communication or what have you, I was thinking, what about gamification? You look at how many people that love to play games, whether they're competitive, whether it's just they want to better their score, whether I'm aging myself at Donkey Kong or I'm in the now with Animal Kingdom or Animal Crossing, where you're trying to get as many flowers as possible. There's a self-guidance of what is success, sometimes related to others, but more often related to self. And I'm wondering if we were to bring that style into education, into learning, whether that might be beneficial.
So but that's turning the concept of score or aggregation into a different thing.
Certainly a more individualized piece.
And that's just one application of that. So what that says to me is that yes, we do need that conversation, and we need a far sort of future reaching way of applying it, of which gamification is one. What are the others?
I agree with what Jonathan's saying. And I think it's so interesting. I'd like to add too that there's always this assumption that career is the focus or employability is the focus. It's almost like everything we assess in school is related to their job in the future or how employable they are. But the truth is, technology makes it so that we don't all have to necessarily work. If we do work, we don't have to work as much. We could have UBI. So even beyond the idea that we're training these kids for jobs that haven't even been invented yet, could we be training them for lives without jobs, a life beyond jobs? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think I'd score very highly in not working.
Playing games. We could all video game all day. I mean, we don't have to work.
Well, if you're good, you make millions here in New York City, by the way, at this World Championships and gaming.
Right. It's big.
I want to add something. Are you hearing me?
Yes,
Yeah.
Carlos, go ahead.
Okay, it's besides solitude that I already wrote there, is that every time that I ask my students, and not only students, even with companies, what is your essence? What is your purpose in life? I always see people really struggling what they want really to do. They don't know exactly what they are passionate about. So even though in some of those letters you can put 1 and 2 and then talk about that, this purpose-driven life should be one of the focus of education and socialization. And just as an analogy, or maybe not, in this book, The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, which I think is a great book, and everybody should read that. Once you are on that stage, then the first regret is not being transparent with himself or herself, and don't doing what the heart was telling him or her or them to do. So I will put that any place as a goal of education.
Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with the points just raised by Carlos and by Amy. I think one of the difficulties is that we've so attached education and qualification to the kind of employment contract that we now kind of say, if there are one of the things that I constantly hear in the UK on the Today programme and similar in the mornings is an invariably plummy voice saying too many kids are going to university now. And they've been to university, their parents went to university, their children are going, and their grandkids are going to. And they're talking about other people's children. And I think we've got to turn that on its head and say, actually, the less employment you have, the more time you have spare, the more important education becomes. Because actually, I'd much prefer have a really good education and nothing to do, rather than have nothing to do and no education. But I think managing to turn that oil tanker is going to be really difficult. And it's not about saying employability doesn't matter. It'll play some part, probably, as far as we can see, and all the rest of it. And politically, we wouldn't just get away with it. But I do think that there is a case for saying, learning for learning's sake, being learned is good. You don't have to be learned through qualifications or through higher ed, but actually everybody does. If we're going to say to working class kids, too many kids are going to university, we need to make sure that the middle class kids who take that as a rite of passage hear it as well. If we're going to push professional and vocational education, we need to push it to everybody, not just kids who've fallen off the academic wheel. So I think there's some real
that. It's an incredible thing to say. I've heard it said as well, and it's just sort of I never really thought about how silly that is, that education is something that's limited or unavailable or to be criticised in some way. And if we align that with some of the things that Amy's been saying as well, in that actually you'll have more time, you're not going to have the job. What a few other people have been saying this morning as well is actually that is very much, that would be such an amazing thing to fill that time, not just fill that time, to have those opportunities in the world in which you are unlikely to be employed in a year-long, 2-year-long, in a single place at a single desk or in a single location. You'll have to know yourself. You have to have that faith in yourself that Carlos is talking about too. Thanks for that. It's a great piece of insight.
One point I I didn't see yet is what about the teachers? We are always talking about the students, what has to change for them. What does it mean for teachers in the future? I think this whole job profile or this mission is going to change probably a lot. And over the weekend, there was an interesting article in the New York Times about all the bright people from Silicon Valley, why we don't get them into politics. The same question you could ask, why is people, young people which are bright and moving forward and are inventors, why do they not dedicate their time also to education? And I don't think it's just only the money, the salary, but nearly all of my friends which were teachers when I went to university, they are not teaching anymore. They all left. And it's not just because of money, for sure. They told me about administration, frustration with whoever is the superior, the district manager of the school, changing focus every 3 or 4 years, less innovation they are able to implement. They are like in a, how do you say, they are like in a corset. They have to do this, and they are not asked to innovate.
So Cyril, I think we did address it a little bit in terms of the platform for agility in both the learning and the teaching. Like it's the whole microcosm of what we're trying to do, removing the fear of trying different things. And administrations do make it hard to try different things if it doesn't fit into the box. Or, you know, we see it not just in education, but professionally, where you often find people that just get frustrated with their jobs because they were hired to do something and then not allowed to do it for whatever administrative or societal or systematic reasons. And so your point is very well taken that teachers are a key component of this, or as I like to say, educators, because to me, teacher implies somebody that is a professional that is in the classroom as the teacher, whereas you don't need, to your point, you don't need to be a professional teacher. That doesn't need to be your occupation to educate others. And if we broaden that thought of what an educator is, that then opens up the envelope to include those who are professional and looking for an outlet to be able to mentor, foster, whatever it is, those that are looking for that information.
And interestingly, in the UK, if you trained and your degree was in teaching, as opposed to a degree in a topic and then a postgrad teaching education, you would be paid less as a starting salary if what you'd done had been learned to teach, which I never understood, because I thought, crikey, I think I know my stuff, but I've got no idea how to share it. I've always found that interesting.
The US is the same, Zoe. As a middle school teacher, I am qualified to teach some of the courses that I'm required to take each year to maintain my license. Like actual universities have said, will you come and lecture for us? We want to hire you. But I just don't want to do that. I like my age level, so I have to pay them to keep my certification current. It's like, why?
Carlos, you just took yourself off mute, and a lot of times you take us out on the perfect note. So I'm putting a lot of pressure on you now. Were you meant to say something?
No, no, I was ready to say goodbye, but no, I just said that if you talk about potentiality of being and actualization of that potentiality, we as a society are failing really big in that. It's like I am seeing so many like flat lives. So this is not about regrets or something. It's that they are not conscious that they can do more. So in terms of education and socialization, we have to do more, because, well, I'm not saying that I am a fully actualized being, but at least I'm trying, and I see people that they are not trying. So that makes me sad and wonder, oh my God, this 30-year-old woman doesn't know that she is living a flat life. And you have to do like this, and that will be my final element, and that's why I would love to contribute with authenticity and education.
Fantastic. And
That's
just
beautiful.
to follow
Thank
up
you.
on that, Carlos, I mentioned it before, but there's a wonderful bit in Ray Bradbury's Dandelion Wine where the young Donald discovers that he's alive, and he's amazed, and he can feel it in his hands and his fingers, and he asks, do other people know they're alive?
Yes,
So-
and it's not correlated with income. It's
Right.
not a matter of income or
Absolutely.
degrees or anything. It's about, I don't know.
So thanks everybody for endeavoring with us on carrying this forward, on hopefully illuminating for society what the possibilities are. How can we move forward in a much stronger, fulfilling, beautiful way? And I don't want to get too touchy-feely at the end of it, but if this education conundrum can be solved, I can't imagine how this world would change. And
Okay,
that's very
Jonathan,
exciting.
sorry, just we haven't talked about the family, any type of family, but it has to go online with everything we talk about education, because we can have the best education in the world, but if we
Right.
have the worst families in the world, then we are losing the impact. So we have to put something about how to connect with families, which makes even bigger the challenge, but there has to be a link.
Okay, so we will come back out with everybody with these headlines, and then please, by all means, raise your hand, come forward. If there's something that you're truly passionate about from this conversation, email us to let us know, I want to take that on. May I please do so? We'd be happy to have that happen. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Zoe.
Thank you.
Always great to see you. We will see you next month. Please check out augmentedsociety.org to find out more about what's coming, what's happened, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao.
Cheers.
Ciao,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.